So this afternoon's panel is how we prevent modern slavery in policy and legislation. When my mum came to the UK from the Philippines in the 1970s, she came for a better life. An agency paid for her ticket, they sorted out her visa, and she worked for a period here in London. She lived in a single room with about 4 other Filipinas, all wanting to do the same thing, and she worked for a period here and paid off the costs associated with coming to the UK. That many migrant workers' stories have the seeds or the kind of elements of that story, but obviously many of those other experiences don't end so happily. And you know, when I think of what my mum sort of explained to me about her early years here in the UK, I think there are so many points in her story where if you sort of change slightly one element of the story, or kind of the slightly different people or regulations or whatever, that a very different outcome could have eventuated. And I think about things like more restrictive immigration laws, or an exploitative employer or an agent, much lower wages, no access to medical care, no effective police and a court system. And all those elements are the sort of conditions which may foster exploitation. And broadly, it's those conditions that are the subject of this afternoon's panel. What does prevention of modern slavery actually mean? How do we get there? How do we achieve it? How do we prevent exploitation before it happens? And while a lot of work's been done on awareness raising, I think there's still less work that has been done, and much more work needs to be done on prevention before exploitation actually happens, and preventing re-trafficking. So I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon's panel, which will look at the different dimensions of this problem. And I'm going to invite each of the panellists to introduce themselves, but we've got Achi, who's a founding chief executive of Migrants at Work, Dr. Liz Such, who is the Rights Lab and McLaren Fellow in Modern Slavery and Public Health at the University of Nottingham, Dr. Leona Vaughn, the senior lecturer at Liverpool University, and Olivia Hesketh, the Director of Policy Impact at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre. And I'm going to now ask each of the panellists to speak for a couple of minutes on some of the themes that are relevant to this question. And we'll start with Liz.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's been such a fantastic day so far on this event. It's great to finish on prevention, because we in fact I think started on prevention very early on today. So my interest is really just thinking about what do we mean as a starter on this topic. So we did some research with the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre and co-created a definition of prevention, because it's a word that's used a lot but not often defined. So we need to know what we mean. We identified that prevention is very much an ongoing process. It doesn't really have a beginning or an end. It's a way of avoiding and minimising exploitation and the harm it generates. And this can be achieved throughout a cycle of activity. It can be achieved by intervening before exploitation occurs, and that's the ideal. We all subscribe to the notion that prevention is better than cure, and that's what that element of the definition gets at. It's about achieving prevention before exploitation occurs. But we don't stop there. We can intervene further along the line if exploitation and trafficking appears to be happening. So that could be early intervention to treat emerging harms. And then if we've failed in our activities at that point, we can carry on trying to make changes, trying to prevent further harm. And that's when we see a lot of the survivor care work that we have in place in the UK now. It's also important to think of prevention in terms of preventing re-trafficking and re-exploitation. And we're starting to see some activity in this area, specific interventions to prevent re-trafficking. And finally, prevention includes enabling people to exercise choice and control over their lives and to thrive. And this was a really important element of the definition that was informed by people with lived experience, because it was really pointed out that a lot of the situations that people found themselves in were ripe for exploitation, and that if the conditions had been different, as Tony explained, where the opportunity to thrive and to have choice and control, then exploitation and trafficking could have been avoided in the first place. So I start with that early definition.
Thanks very much, Liz. I've just remembered that I've got a microphone attached to me, so I don't need to hold the other one. So there we are. Olivia, I'll ask next to mention some of her work on cross-governmental modern slavery strategy.
Thank you very much, Tony. And it's really great to have a panel dedicated to prevention at today's conference, because it is a relatively underdeveloped aspect of the UK's policy response to modern slavery. So last autumn, at the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre, we published a report on policy priorities for the new government. And in that report, we highlighted that there are real opportunities to take a much more prevention-centred approach to modern slavery in the UK, and the importance of that taking a whole system and whole-of-government approach. In terms of why we recommended such a strong focus on prevention, we know from evidence that it has really obvious benefits in terms of reducing harm, reducing impact of exploitation, both on people and communities affected, as well as the associated economic costs of modern slavery. And as has been mentioned as a common theme across many of the discussions today, we know that because modern slavery is so complex and so intertwined with so many other linked policy agendas, where choices that are made on those wider linked policies can have direct consequences for potentially increasing risk of modern slavery, but conversely could have a preventative effect. I think today we've heard particularly around the workers' rights, employment rights enforcement regime and immigration regime, but I think those linked areas go even wider, including things like internet safety. We have the implementation of the Online Safety Act happening in the UK right now. Issues such as the move towards much more green energy in the UK, and what we know about the risks of forced labour in production of solar panels, for example. And I think, as well as already been pointed out, whilst modern slavery wasn't specifically in the government's, the Labour Party manifesto ahead of the election, modern slavery, as our report shows, is highly relevant to almost all of the government's 5 big missions. So, for example, under economic growth, around the Employment Rights Bill, under breaking down barriers to opportunity, there's commitment to produce a new homelessness strategy. We know there are strong links between homelessness and modern slavery as well. And this all really underlines the importance of having a really effective mechanism across government to collaborate at the policy level on prevention. In our report, the Policy and Evidence Centre recommended that a new cross-government strategy would be a really useful vehicle for this collaboration. Also, I think it's worth thinking about the actual kind of mechanics within government. There's been lots of different tools used in the past, interdepartmental ministerial groups, Prime Minister chaired task force. There's obviously a set of mission boards at the moment, but I think getting that mechanical side of how government comes together is really important. And then my final reflection, and perhaps this is something that we'll come on to in the Q&A, and it's really, I guess, a bit of a plea to researchers, to research funders in the room, is really the importance of having much more evidence about the effectiveness of different approaches and different interventions on prevention, particularly at that before harm has occurred stage. I think it's something that we don't have lots of evidence on. And just to give an example, at the Policy and Evidence Centre a few years ago, we funded lots of research looking at the impact of the COVID pandemic on modern slavery. We pulled all of that together in a policy brief. And what we kind of found is that interventions such as the furlough scheme to protect wages, interventions to provide hotel accommodation to people who are homeless during the pandemic probably did have a preventative effect in terms of reducing risks of exploitation. But actually having the evidence to prove that as a causal link is much more challenging. So definitely a need for more evidence to inform the response.
Thanks very much, Olivia. Achi, why don't you tell us a little bit about more the realities on the ground?
So the reality on the ground, so my organization is called Migrants at Work. So it's a SOLEX organization. So SOLEX stands for Self organized lived experience organization. So we look at the issue from a different angle. So since this morning, I've been hearing people talking about modern slavery, and when we talk about modern slavery, we only look at forced labor, servitude. We look at the condition of the individual. We really moved away from modern slavery because that's not a reality on the ground. So I kind of developed the concept of homegrown slavery. So we look at how the UK immigration law conflict with bilateral trade agreement. So you have on the one hand, UK immigration law created the status, a system that put people into slavery. The people are trapped. The workers are coming through visa, they are trapped. So that's their status. Then you have the UK government or any kind of a state making a bilateral agreement with different states to bring people over here to work. So that is the international human supply chain. We can use another word to say that's the slave trade. Okay, so you have this legal mechanism that bring people into exploitation, but it's not being addressed as the slave trade. Nobody talk about that. We always talk about modern slavery, just looking at the condition of the individual, but we forget about this human supply chain. So we have this system, immigration law, intersecting with bilateral trade agreement. And then on top of that, you have to look at employment law. When people have an issue in the workplace, because of their sponsorship licenses, they cannot report issues to any kind of authority. And when they do that, they have no protection in employment law. They have no protection in immigration law. The whistleblowing legislation does not protect them. And they report the cases to the Home Office. Then what does the Home Office do? The Home Office either investigate the employer. When they do that, if they have good evidence provided by the victim, then the Home Office revoke the sponsor's license, and this worker then no longer have the right to work. They cannot go home because they pay a lot of money and people are waiting for them back home. So they say in the UK, the visa is expired, they cannot work, and every single night I have people on the phone calling me because they want to kill themselves. So these are the kind of things we deal with on the ground. And when we reach out to statutory agencies, they don't understand, they don't know how to deal with the problem. So if we talk about prevention, we need to forget about modern slavery. We need to look at the slave trade and try to understand how this legal system conflict with one another to create vulnerability, not labor exploitation, but to create vulnerability, the status of the individual.
Thank you, Achi. And then the last kind of opening statement from Leona Vaughn about sort of international.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, it's difficult to follow after Achi's comments there. No, absolutely. You know, that is the reality on the ground. For the past few years, I've been working with UN projects that have been focused on protection and prevention, very much guided by the Palermo Protocol. So I don't know whether everyone knows what the Palermo Protocol is, but I'll give a very brief version of it. So that's the protocol to prevent, suppress and punish trafficking in persons, especially for women and children. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in the year 2000. It defines trafficking, including the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of a person for the purpose of exploitation. But the bit that I'd like to encourage us to have some deeper thought about is what they call the 4 Ps. So the 4 Ps are that states should improve partnerships to address trafficking in persons, improve prosecutions of offenders, improve protection for victims, and act to address prevention. Now, I read that out specifically because I do think that there is some overlap and not very well developed understanding. I think this follows on from Liz's point about protection and prevention. And is there a difference in what those distinctions actually are? And what we see through the Trafficking in Persons report, the Global Trafficking in Persons report, is that different states are doing well in different places. Some are not doing so well in different places. But consistently, prevention is not particularly well developed in its understanding. And I think that there's a couple of reasons behind that. You know, we can measure the other things. We can measure how many prosecutions take place. We can measure how many victims achieve remedy or restitution. But how do you measure when modern slavery doesn't happen? I mean, that's a real difficulty. And I think there is interconnection between those sort of topic areas. You know, strong law, successful prosecutions, they can be argued as a deterrent, that in some way they contribute to prevention. But really, in my view and my experience, prevention really needs some development in terms of how people understand it within the government. Do they really know what it means, how it looks in opposition to protection, or actually should we be focused on protection? I'll say a little bit more about that as we talk. And what does success look like? How do we measure this thing? So my research is around risk and prevention and social policy. I've had the privilege of doing research with people who have lived experience of exploitation, research that considers individual vulnerabilities to victimisation or re-victimisation, and research which considers structural level vulnerabilities, what can be referred to as social risks or systemic inequalities, such as discrimination and poverty, all of which, and again, echoing Liz here, provide the material conditions for modern slavery to thrive. You know, so what I'd really like us to think about is, you know, how do we address what we're seeing in terms of global megatrends? Global megatrends say the intersection of poverty and inequality, exacerbated by the pandemic impact, armed conflict, climate crisis. These things are all driving modern slavery up and up and up. But what I've seen in modern slavery policy, similarly to most preventative policy areas actually that I've looked at, is, particularly in the criminal justice arena, a tendency to solely look at an individualised risk, to see it on a personal level that we need to seek to control in order to protect or prevent those people from being exploited, but less of a tendency for policy to articulate risk as both structural and individual, and use that understanding to develop policy solutions for protection. So I really think that we should be developing our thinking and our practice in this area.
Thanks very much, Leona. So everyone has set out a lot of the problems and a lot of the challenges. We're talking about how we move forward and how we actually kind of change things, really. And that requires confronting the fact that we are where we are. And so I'm going to start this brief section of discussion between the panellists, and before we move on to hear everyone's questions. Where do we start? So there are so many things that need to be done. But I might direct that question first of all to Olivia. How should we start? How should somebody who is pushing government to act on this, what should they be starting with?
I think there are two things. I think the first is around building a really good understanding about those interconnections between wider policy areas and modern slavery, and building the evidence base. And promoting that knowledge to policymakers and lawmakers, not just those focused on modern slavery, but those working on wider themes. For example, within my team recently, we did a small exercise where we looked at parliamentary select committees and the topics of their inquiries at the moment. And we found loads of committees doing inquiries on topics that are really relevant to modern slavery, such as the Education Committee on Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, some of the kind of more climate change focused committees focused on green energy, committees looking at the government's targets around building 1.5 million new homes before the end of the Parliament. We know construction is a high risk sector. None of those inquiries are looking particularly at kind of risks of exploitation for people, for the environment. And so I think there is a need to kind of really just be putting that evidence in front of policymakers in those wider linked areas, as well as those focused on modern slavery. And then I think as well, it's about kind of identifying the very specific opportunities that are there, that we know that the government has committed to, and trying to integrate modern slavery prevention into those. So in our report, we highlight kind of several areas, some of which I've already mentioned, but things like the new homelessness strategy, new trade strategy, the planned reform of the points-based immigration system, the kind of implementation of the Online Safety Act. There are lots of examples of very specific policies underway where there are opportunities to bring that knowledge about the links to modern slavery to try and inform kind of better policy design.
So do you think then that we should almost be going into the Cabinet Office as a coordinator of different government departments and saying, let's start this cross-governmental strategy here, and try and feed it down in the way that similar things are happening with supply chains, for example, as a specific element of policy? Is that one approach?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a need for a kind of cross-government mechanism. Whether that's driven, which department drives that, I think is a wider question. I think, the Home Office is the lead government department on modern slavery and obviously has a lot of kind of responsibilities in respect of that. But I think at the moment there is not that kind of cross-government structure in place to really try and drive that forward. I think there are definitely pockets of departments working well together, for example, on forced labour and global supply chains. The recent government response to the House of Lords Committee was really clear about the role of DBT, the Department of Business and Trade, compared to FCDO and the Home Office. But having that clarity across the entirety of modern slavery policy would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that comes out of the Employment Rights Bill is this Fair Work Agency, and all of the exploitation that we often see is in the context of employment relationships or worker relationships. And I just wondered, Achi, what your thoughts are about what the potential for this Fair Work Agency, the details of which have not all been worked out, that the Employment Rights Bill creates powers to set up this agency that perhaps puts some of the gangmasters licensing work and areas that are not currently regulated into potentially the umbrella of that agency. I mean, what would you like to see from that agency to try to, hit all these different areas of problems that relate to employment exploitation, given your experience?
I don't think it's going to bring any change. It's not going to be helpful, because the issue we are having with exploitation of slavery, the slave trade, I think we first need to break down everything. We need to look at modern slavery, like I said, on the one hand as a condition, and the slave trade on the other hand. So if you look at this way, so we need to start having two different conversations. So when you have a modern slavery policy trying to tackle modern slavery, but without looking at the slave trade, this human supply chain, you are not addressing the problem. So now going to this legislation or this bill, it is dealing with employment law. The issue that we see on the ground is not employment law. The problem is immigration law. The solution is criminal law. Employment law is not going to be able to address the issue that is related to criminal law. And if these agencies are empowered to intervene in the workplace, to try to support the worker, this is not going to be helpful, because unless you have one agency that have the knowledge in immigration law, employment law, criminal law, international human rights law, then it will be possible to tackle the problem. But employment law alone is not going to do anything. It's just going to create more problem, because what it does is that because you have this legislation dealing with employment issue, you forget about all the other problems, criminal law, all these kind of problems, you just completely push them aside. Yeah. It's going to create more problem.
So we need to look at the whole system as one. I mean, Liz, what do you think when you hear the answers that the two panellists have given your research about this whole system approach that we need to be taking, rather than, one particular area or one other particular area, employment or immigration or whatever?
Absolutely, yeah. This is something that came through really strongly in the research that we did. We identified areas of, and so we weren't looking at policy in this particular area. What we're looking at community-led interventions, particular programs within communities, and we found that partnership was really important to deliver preventative interventions, and those, like Olivia was saying, were maybe focused not specifically relating to modern slavery and human trafficking, but might be about interventions to support children, young people live meaningful, stress-free lives, meaningful activities, either homelessness prevention interventions, substance misuse policies and interventions. And so there was this kind of systems interventions across the system, but they weren't necessarily being coordinated. And so that the argument for whole systems is not just at a policy level, but it's also at the local level. So I think there's an argument in prevention that we have a whole systems approach that's got a strategic direction from a central place, which may be Home Office, it may be elsewhere, it might be a Cabinet Office issue, but then we devolve to the local level to identify what the local system needs in that area, and those and that support and those preventative pieces of work may happen in schools, they may happen with policing, they may happen in the NHS, and there's some good examples out there. They're usually small, and they usually have small numbers of people going through them. They might have small numbers of staff that are very precariously funded, but they are happening, and we need to capture the evidence from those really important community-based initiatives, because that's where the action is happening. Is prevention is happening in communities, and we don't see it. And so we don't evaluate it, and then we don't recognise it.
And going from the local to zooming out as far as we can, I mean, looking at, the Palermo Protocol itself, for example. I mean, Leona, how far is this already, this is already sorted for us in the Palermo Protocol? We've just got to implement. I mean...
Well, I mean, there are problems, like I alluded to earlier, in terms of the lack of definition between prevention and protection. But I do think that there's a lot that we can learn. And this is where maybe I'm going to be a little bit of an outlier. I think that we really do need a radical rethink and a radical reimagining of modern slavery. I think that what we've got is something that was very much shaped by the idea of modern slavery be something that happens in supply chains that go way beyond our borders and shores, that is linked to immigration. But if we're really truly wanting to address this in a universal way, we really need to be thinking about social risks. And this is something that IOM, particularly their project, which is around addressing vulnerability in displaced populations, have developed a really great model, which really encourages us to think, and I'm going to quote them here, about the hazards, risks and stresses which undermine social protection or social safety. And I think that we should be really looking to that and learning from that. When we're developing this cross-departmental strategy, Eleanor talked about, an opportunity here to really have a radical rethink around how this strategy looks. I think we should actually go very much on the basis of, we know what the social risks are. We know what people are telling us, why they've ended up in modern slavery. We know that that's about poverty, discrimination, climate crisis, forcible displacement, all of these things. If we start thinking about that as hazards, stresses and risks for all populations, including domestic populations, and I'll link back to Jess's point about the NRM system not really working for domestic populations. Well, it didn't, because it was really created to control immigration. Let's be honest about this. So let's think about this so radically differently that we start thinking about how do we protect populations, all populations, whether it's young people in South Shields, whether it's older people in Leicester, whether it's migrant workers in Sussex. Why don't we start thinking about what do we do to protect our citizens and the people who are here in a model which actually thinks about all of those things as risks, hazards and stresses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've got 15 minutes left, and I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, because I really wanted to hear, we all want to hear from you, to hear what you think and what you want to ask us. So there are a couple of roving mics. We'll take questions a few at a time. If you tell us your name, and I'll take three, and then we'll do them in blocks of three.
Hi, I'm Ariel. I work for a charity called Medical Justice. We work with people in immigration detention. It's sort of a comment and a question. I think immigration detention, which is where a lot of survivors of trafficking do end up, hasn't been mentioned at all in any of the sessions today. And I think it's, my question is, how can we learn more about the harms caused to people who are survivors of trafficking in detention, and how to prevent them from getting in detention in the first place, and then potentially being forcibly removed to danger, to torture, to potentially death. I really want it to be part of the conversation as well.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amelia Woodley. I'm a Executive Director of a FTSE 350 company. I'm also Board Director of Bright Future, which is a charity that supports modern slavery survivors into employment. It's been a great session today, and we've heard a lot of talk about businesses and partnerships, but I think it's a real shame that there are no businesses represented on the panels today. And I raise that because we know as an organisation and as business, the Modern Slavery Act was never strong enough to mandate businesses to do what they needed to do. Despite that, we've seen huge shifts in investors requiring us to be more transparent, which has been amazing. We've seen the modern slavery tool from the Home Office, meaning that we have to be really clear about where our modern slavery risks are. So it becomes a risk to organisations and it becomes a revenue issue as well. But what we're not seeing is that mandatory policy and regulation. And I'll give you an example. Despite those organisations that are going above the legislation because they want to be successful and they want to do the right thing, there are businesses in the value chain that are refusing to be transparent on their modern slavery and human rights, which is really problematic for us because we can't enforce it. The other side of it, we heard a very impassioned speech this afternoon from the Liv survivors, which I think would have been great if it was a core speech, because this is about survivors at the end of the day. Now, the government released the Social Value Act 2 weeks ago, which requires organisations to look at inclusive recruitment. So that looks at young people, disabled people, care leavers, those not in employment or education. There is nothing in there about employment of survivors. So the survivors here today talked very passionately about, I just want to be treated like a human and be given a job. Now, under the social value accounting metric, if I employ a care leaver, I get £50,000 worth of social value return on investment. If I employ a modern slavery survivor, I get zero. There is no financial incentive under the accounting mechanisms to open up those opportunities. So how is the Cabinet Office going to close those loops? And Olivia, you talked about transitions. As organisations go through net zero transitions, we cannot have that built on human rights and modern slavery, like the Industrial Revolution. We have to connect these themes for businesses. We have to put policy and regulation in, and we have to give those survivors opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Kende Ojo. I'm a program officer at the Freedom Fund. I'm also part of Survivor Alliance and BASNet. And I have a question regarding, because you mentioned a lot about how the solution or the preventative measures are locally centered. So I think a lot of the talk today have been about national policies. So what are the roles that you think local government will play in terms of preventing modern slavery in their own community? And my second question, it's probably directed to Hythe. It says, can we say that the UK work visa system is any different from the kafala system in the Middle East? And what are the ways that we can improve protections for migrant workers? Thank you.
Thank you. Take one more before we go to answers. Did you? Yeah, just up in the eye.
Hi, it's me again from the Survivor Alliance. I just want to thank Achi, because what you said makes sense. When I started to do public speaking, I was invited on a panel in Manchester by BASNet, and one of the GLA, is it gangster something, was there. And before this thing of abusing skilled workers coming to the UK escalated, before we started hearing on BBC to say they are making workers to pay a lot of money to come, I did speak to the man and told him the NRM is going to be overwhelmed with care workers coming in because this is what is happening. And I advised him, I asked him if they could even be at the airport, see people who are coming to do care work, question them where they're going to prevent the NRM to be overwhelmed. He looked at me, he didn't listen to me, he thought it was a joke. A few weeks later, it was in the news that care workers are being abused. Even right now, there's a social worker who's he's only worked 10 months because of us not knowing the rights in the UK. Rights is killing us. If you can train somebody coming to the UK and tell us our rights so that we know, and if anything happens, we know where to start from. This person, because of rights, he's only worked 10 months. there's a mistake that was made in the home care he's working, and they've used him as an scapegoat because he's only 10 months. They can't pay him any money. And the person who made that mistake is still working in the company and has been working there and is still there. So he's been fired. Now for him to get a new course, he's got visa, he needs a course. So how does he go about it? Because for him to get a job, he needs the company to give him a reference. So what reference would they give it to him? And already his DBS is damaged. So what you're talking about, I'm really, really grateful, and I want to connect with you because there's so many people suffering out there who are living on 20 hours a week, but they've been brought into the UK and they don't know their rights.
Yeah.
I'm coming from a third world country. My country, even on the UK website from the commission in my country, corruption is bad. For one to get a job, you have to pay someone. Some women have to sleep with certain people to get a job. So when some people were coming here, they'll tell them, oh, if you don't pay, you won't get a job. They paid a lot of money to get those jobs, and they don't have money. And they convert our currency into the British money into our currencies. It's a lot. But when they're in the UK, the money is not that much. So Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. I completely agree about the points about the system. There's nothing properly regulating that sector. I mean, my mum worked as a care worker for years, and I know that, you know, it's just a wild west. And certainly, I mean, we mentioned the Fair Work Agency earlier, but I think that has really got to be, in my view, the body that's got to crack down on this, because there isn't anything at the moment. Shall we start with Ariel's question about immigration detention, which is obviously, you know, in some ways the elephant in the room. I agree with you. It is the logic currently of immigration control, but there are so many issues around, you know, how that is being applied and the readiness with which people are being detained. But did anyone want to pick up that question? Okay.
Yeah, so people being in immigration detention, as far as I'm concerned, they are slaves in these immigration detention, because you have people who are working in these immigration detention. They are considered as worker under unemployment law, but they are excluded from the immigration rule. So whatever work they are doing the work as a worker, but they are not being paid as a worker or as an employee, simply because they have been excluded from the immigration rule by the from employment law by the immigration rule. So you have people who are exploited, who sometimes going to end up in detention because of the immigration status, but you have those who are in detention, asylum seeker in detention, who are being exploited, but nobody's looking at that because they are in the process of being deported and going to...
Yeah. I mean, the concern I've got is that under the current Borders Security Bill, you've got Section 29 of the Illegal Migration Act, which isn't yet enforced, but could be commenced, which, you know, is going to make it difficult for anyone who is in detention because they've been prosecuted for an offence perhaps related to their trafficking, and are then in a situation where they're deprived of trafficking protection, which I think is going to make it harder to prosecute traffickers, and it's going to mean that criminal justice outcomes are less good, and there's not going to be justice for victims. But it looks like that may well be staying in for now. There is a sort of wider review of the NRM going on, and it may be that that provision is looked at in the context of that review. But it's a difficult one. Amelia's question about the Modern Slavery not being strong enough, Modern Slavery Act not being strong enough, and no mandatory policies or legislation which make all businesses have to do it, right? That's the point you're making. And so, you know, you're relying on sort of goodwill almost, and not requiring everyone to play by the same rules. I mean, did anyone have any thoughts about Amelia's question? Olivia?
Yeah, I mean, in the time available, I suppose I focused my remarks around kind of central government and policy, but I think, you know, in order for prevention to be effective, it absolutely involves kind of all of the different groups who are represented at today's event, and in particular, businesses, local community groups, local authorities, faith groups, for example, all have a really important role to play. And I think the role of business, I guess, really goes back to some of Liz's points about how you frame and define prevention, because I think a lot of the activity that businesses do, and particularly assessing risk in the supply chains, putting in place due diligence measures is a form of kind of preventative focused activity, trying to look at where the risks are and mitigate those as early as possible. I think in the 2014 modern slavery strategy, which had kind of borrowed its framework from the counter-terrorism strategy that was in place at the time, I think all of the kind of business and supply chains material was underneath the protect or the prepare pillar rather than the prevent pillar, but I think it really is a form of prevention, the work that businesses are doing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you mentioned the thing about the financial incentives point, I mean, people who are perhaps helping people who've come out of prison and are seeking to rehabilitate themselves have made similar points to me, and lots of different groups in society who need that little extra push fall into exactly the same category. I don't know what you thought, Liz, about the extent to which financial incentives are a way of trying to prevent in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not my area of expertise, and the piece of work that we did, we didn't focus on business in particular, but I also kind of recognise that there's in prevention, it's such an all-encompassing umbrella piece of work. It has the potential to include all of us, and it goes to the point that the Commissioner made about it's everybody's business. And so when we make it everybody's business, it means we all have the part to play in prevention, which includes the prison system, policing system, social care, all of these local and community-based initiatives. So it becomes a huge challenge to create that coherence around what prevention looks like and can do. And that's why we need this kind of centralised thinking, but with input from all areas. On the local authority point, I think there's a lot of good work going in very small corners of local government, which was great to hear from Hebe Lawson, who was in a previous panel. But there's only 9 local government modern slavery coordinators currently out of over 300 local authorities. So, you know, there's so much room for growth, but I think we really need to do that in a very strategic way with prevention at its core and about preventing the worst from happening in the first place.
And I do think that your point really highlights, for me, the disparate approaches. You know, I've worked with businesses, financial institutions who are doing work to invest and build schools, for example, address gender inequalities, looking at, you know, worker engagement as part of their, you know, their operations. And yet we don't have that sort of in a domestic context of thinking about that here in situ. And for me, you know, your point really highlights this disconnectedness between policy. If we've got a Social Value Act, it makes sense that that should speak directly to the Modern Slavery Act. You know, it really doesn't make sense for those two things to be happening, you know, in disparate, siloed ways.
Yeah.
I think I just want to add for the business. I don't know all the technical business stuff you said. It's not my area. But what I can say is on the ground. And I think businesses should be working closely with people with lived experience on the ground. I've been working with businesses. The problem businesses are having is that if the individual are finding that they're being exploited, they are unlikely to speak to businesses. And if businesses will work with us, as I have done in the past, where businesses hear from their employee that they're potentially issue of exploitation, then they reach out to us and we speak to the worker, and we are this way able to identify the supply chain of exploitation, and then we can work together. But most of the time, businesses want to work with trade union, and trade union, there is also a big problem in the sector. So I would really encourage businesses to work with, for example, my organization, because we have lived experience. I've been doing this work. I think I have more experience than anybody in this area, I mean, in this room, because I'm a former child laborer. I came to Europe when I was 10 years old, and I've been in this field, working 40 years in this field. So I have together all my lived experience, almost 50 years of experience. So this is this kind of a, you know, partnership that we can have to try to support people on the ground.
Do we have time for another round of questions? It's 4 o'clock, I can see. Who can decide?
And you said
We don't. All right, well, look, thanks everyone for your question. If you still want to ask your question, you should approach us afterwards if we're still around. But
sorry, no, the lady over there had a question, but I can speak to you.
Yeah, I think the local government point was addressed to a degree. But yeah, sorry we've run out of time. But thanks everyone. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It was really useful.